item is the civil citations. So he has noise and now marijuana, and I'll just give a brief introduction. Since the last time we talked about this, we sent our resolution to the county, and I've been in contact with Commissioner Welch, and he's in agreement with what I've asked for today. In the interim, there was a meeting called by the clerk of the court, which I was not able to attend because it fell on the city council day. And I just got the minutes from that meeting last night, so I gave them out to you. But I would like to, I had a little bit of concern about the meeting because the speaker that they brought in from Hernando County started out by saying, well, Mr. Clerk, you do a good job of hiding your biases, but I'm completely biased against this program, but I'll try to hold it in. And that was the beginning of the discussion. There were several references to, well, the elected officials just need to stay out of this kind of references. I do want to say, I don't think that kind of dialogue is helpful. So I did ask Mark Wynn was there, and Ms. McDermott from the police department was also there. And I do want to say thank you to our legal staff, of course, and to Ms. McDermott, but to our entire police department, because they didn't bring that kind of rhetoric into the discussion. They came in with 3 concerns, and I noticed in these minutes, Ms. McDermott said, I still have these 3 concerns. These are our concerns. And while what I intend to ask for at the end of this is for us to give some feedback and a draft ordinance be drafted, not brought up to city council, but then sent to the county commission, because if the discussion goes the way of the elected officials should just stay out of this, I disagree with that completely. I have no intention of staying out of it and letting them do what they would like. What was conspicuously absent from this discussion was any discussion of disparities, any discussion of income levels, for example. Do income levels affect your outcome that you get in court? That whole discussion did not happen. So there's pieces of this that I think are very helpful. I do also want to point out there's a lot of discussion about a private vendor. And this is all just coming from the private vendor. Apparently there's a private vendor in Leon County that runs their program. And I have never talked to that vendor. I have no intention of supporting an ordinance that uses a private corporation to enforce it. So I don't know where that was coming from, but there were a lot of people who made comments in here like, well, this is just that private vendor, and they've been evangelizing about this, and that's not acceptable to me. And that's where this is coming from. This did not come, the people that I talked to were the ACLU and the American Bar Association, which are very credible organizations, had very good points. So I just thought today an update from Mark on what was discussed at the meeting. And then I'd like us to discuss what we might put into a draft ordinance. And keep in mind, I have been talking to Commissioner Welch all along, and he's fine with what we're attempting to do today. And I think it's important that everybody's included and this be a very real discussion, but not rhetoric. The discussion needs to happen. And I appreciate our police department because they've done that. They said, here's some ways we think this could be implementable. If you did these 3, answer these three concerns, we can work with that. The other stuff is difficult. So with that,
yeah, it was an interesting meeting.
Did a little bit of it, but
okay, you did much of it. It was a very interesting meeting, as Steve said. The sheriff was there, the Nellis County clerk, and the Hernando County clerk, the state attorney, public defender, and a bunch of people with guns. And it was mostly a discussion. Many of them were from smaller departments, police departments, and they weren't. Well, they heard about this concept, they weren't really aware of it. There was a lot of negative discussion at the beginning. Many people were kind of against it. As Steve mentioned, most of them were looking at the law enforcement and the violation of the law side as opposed to the other types of attacks that we discussed here on various peoples of different levels of equality. So it was kind of an interesting discussion. It's not particularly positive at the beginning, but there was a lot of information that was shared and perspectives at the end. The sheriff, the state attorney, and the public defender pretty much said that they seem to indicate that before there were free trial diversion programs statewide, that they kind of piloted that in the state many years ago. They seem to think that this would be something they could also pilot in the state. So the sheriff was tasked with coming up with kind of a plan to do it in our county at a level that didn't require an ordinance or law, to do a program that the judicial system had and police participated in. So that's kind of where it was left. The second reading hasn't been scheduled yet, and we have not seen a draft of what the sheriff's proposing. So that's where that's it. My understanding was that at one point the county had scheduled a meeting to discuss this or workshop, and that with the change of chairman up there, that meeting is not currently scheduled, but they're looking forward to scheduling a different one or another one, I should say. That may be after the session. As you may know, there are several bills working their way through the session that do something similar to this type of program. There's a Senate bill, a committee House bill, and recently a committee substitute for those that have different regulations. Most of them, from reading them, don't appear to take into the account the type of concerns that we had for the equality of the income levels of people, the people that were greatly harmed. It was more about the enforcement and giving first-time offenders of a number of small minor violations, some kind of a break so they don't have a record. And that, well, certainly that's a part of the goal that we had, is certainly not all of the goal. And most of them all have a treatment and intervention program for whoever gets into the program, plus community service and fines. So it's not necessarily addressing people that don't have much money or helping them through. And maybe, so there is a private program that has been promoting this, in particularly Leon County. They're active in Leon County and running the program, and they've been promoting it statewide. That's not, again, their goal is to have people refer to their program, so they charge them for their services. That's probably a little simple. I'm sure they're trying to help. So right now we have the state legislation moving forward. The county is discussing it, and the law enforcement folks in the county are discussing the program also. So we're going to have those three moving things at this particular point. I've done the research to make sure that this is something that we actually can do, that we're not preempted by the state has a very comprehensive system of drug laws that regulate the use of drugs. So my initial concern was that we were completely preempted from acting in this area, but we're not. There's some old cases that say that we can act in this area unless the legislature specifically preempts us. We can still act in the area as long as we're not acting in contravention of what their laws are. So we can make a lesser penalty if we want to, but we could make a greater penalty for any offender. So we can move forward with something like there are half a dozen or so cities or counties around the state that have implemented some form of the program. Some of them are very similar, some are quite different. I was talking with Ms. McDermott and the Hernando County clerk, who has done research on, talked to the people that have implemented programs. Most have not been fully implemented, so it's difficult or impossible to really gauge how effective they are. So at this point, we're right on the front edge of discussing those and finding out what will work and how to do it. Obviously, if we adopt an ordinance, it's only going to be effective in St. Petersburg and couldn't involve the court system because we'd have to have the clerks agree to do that in the sheriff's department. So that's pretty much where we stand right now. I just saw these minutes that stuck out last night. I just got them now, so I haven't even had a chance to read them yet at this point. But I was looking. I don't know what your pleasure is. My intention was to see what the sheriff came up with, bring that back to you, and then see where we can go from there, unless you want me to do something else.
And my concern is that the state may jump in and try to preempt, so I'd like to have us to have an ordinance ready. We don't have to pass it. I think we can still work with the county. And Mark, correct me if I'm off on this. Ms. McDermott again reiterated three concerns that she stated here. One, that doing it countywide is more uniform. The fines need to be collectible. There needs to be some mechanism if somebody doesn't pay the fine to kind of compel them to pay the fine. And she had one more. And and funding for the program, that we're not putting on them as an unfunded mandate. I think those are reasonable. I think that's what our police department said in the first meeting we had. It's what Ms. McDermott said at this other meeting with Clerk Burke. I think it's reasonable. What I did notice, and Mark, I'd still like to see this, but short of this, and I know people have said, well, it's difficult to get. I'd like to see some information on the number of people arrested, the penalties they get, so we see if there's real disparities there. Statistics are pretty cut and dry. So.
Hi, my name is Paul McWade, I'm a major police department. Mr. McDermott asked me to stop by to give you some statistics. I'll start with telling you it is difficult for us to, I know you were asking questions of how many people were actually charged with misdemeanor amounts of marijuana. We're able to pull that information. In the year 2015, there were 1,131 people that were charged with misdemeanor amount of marijuana. And that's not saying that that's the only charge, and that's not saying they actually went to jail. We were able to break that down. The problem we have is our system doesn't, we can't just pull just that question out of it. So we actually have to read these reports, 1,131 cases. What we did is we were able to figure out that 984 of that 1,131 were adults, 147 were juvenile. What I asked them to do is to read every juvenile case, 147 cases. What we were able to find out that 62 of the 147 cases, the juvenile was actually taken to jack. The other ones, they were released with a notice to appear. I asked them to tell me exactly if there were any other charges of the 62 that were actually taken, and of that 18, that was the only charge. The other 44, there was something else. The kid was found in a stolen car and he had weed on him. Or he was on detention, so when you arrest a child that's on detention, that's a charge, as well as the marijuana amount. So those are the numbers for juvenile. For adult, it was a lot more difficult. What I asked them to do is, I asked them to try to tell me how many were arrested, how many noticed to appear. You can't quote me on this because the system doesn't give exactly, but they said about 60% were actually taken to jail, and the others were actually released somehow. And again, a lot of those people were dual charged. I did tell them that instead of just going through all of the ones that were arrested, which is about almost 600, I said, go pull me a stack of them randomly and tell me the ones, now these are people that actually were arrested and taken to jail. Tell me if there were any additional charges. So they pulled out 67 cases and read them, and 12 of them, that was the only charge. The others, there was some additional type of charge, like they were in a stolen car or something else happened. So there was 12. And that's really all I could tell you. I mean, I've got 29 years on it. I've asked a lot of officers about why somebody would arrest and take them to jail if it's just for misdemeanor amount of marijuana. There's usually something else, like either, if ICE asked me to stop anybody and arrest anybody in this area because we're looking at that area for narcotics, and that might be a case where I would have taken somebody for misdemeanor amount of marijuana. Or what I hear from some officers are, when I checked out with them, all I got was attitude. They didn't want to give me the name. So in that case, that person's probably going to go to jail. And that's what I was finding from the officers that I talked to.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, questions, Councilman Kennedy?
Thank you. Just looking through this transcript quickly, there seemed to have been some discussion on whether 20 grams was the right amount. Mark, do you want to?
There was a little bit of discussion about that, but I don't think there was a large disagreement about it. I got the impression from the tone of some of the chiefs that they felt that was maybe too high. The discussion was, well, 20 grams, that's more than just a joint, which may only be a couple of grams. But I think most of them seem to ultimately think that that was really a personal amount, not necessarily something for sale, which was, I think, what their concern was. Usually my understanding is that, the people that use this don't necessarily carry around just one joint at a time. They may have a small resource of bag of pot. So there may be more than one or two joints. And I think most of them recognize that this is really most of the personal consumption the size of stuff.
Is there legislation going forward in Tallahassee to preempt municipalities from taking this type of action?
It doesn't preempt us. The legislation going forward specifically does not preempt us. It does create a little bit of confusion because what it talks about is that it says that it doesn't preempt us, but then it says any civil citation program that's adopted shall do this and shall do that. So while they specifically don't preempt us, it says what we shall do if we adopt one. So it creates an opportunity for some confusion, and we'll have to look into whether or not that, how that would impact anything.
So I think it's strongly favorable to do this countywide as opposed to city, but I don't see any detriment to moving a step forward and continuing to potentially lead along those lines. So you would be saying your next step would be to sit down and come up with a draft ordinance based on our last conversation and a little bit of this conversation for us to then go through that ordinance? Would that be the next step?
Could be either one of two things. One, we can wait and see, or at least wait and see what the sheriff and the local people decide to do. Or you can ask me to start drafting something, and I can bring that to you when I get back from my Louise trip in February.
I don't think, if they say this question of how long do we wait, from what I hear, nothing really is scheduled in that regard. So ideally, I think it would be nice to sit back and say, okay, county, take the lead. But it probably may make sense to continue to be a leading edge at this point in time.
You know, if we're going to adopt something, you know, even countywide, I'm more than happy to participate in that drafting. We work with county maintainers to draft ordinances. We have certainly a different perspective. You know, the densest city, the county isn't the city, they're a county. We're the city, we have problems are a little more acute for us in certain areas, so we have a little different experience. So when we get to write ordinances in conjunction with them, usually they turn out pretty well.
Well, I guess I'd make a motion that we continue to monitor what the county and sheriff are doing, but request legal to put together a draft of an ordinance to bring back to this committee for further discussion.
Thank you. And that's exactly what I'm requesting. Councilmember Rice.
Thank you, Chair. I just also wanted to add to that and say I totally agree that I think there's a lot of wisdom in us putting a forward spin on the issue by drafting our own ordinance, and just wanted to share, just anecdotally, that when we drafted our own, for example, wage theft ordinance,